So in the last video, we began talking about the first and the second industrial revolution. And today we're going to look at what life was like in industrial society. And as you can imagine, the living conditions were abysmal. Popular literature from the time, government documents from this time just portray grievous conditions for the urban working person and family. So we're going to start with population growth and the Industrial Revolution. So industrialization and the population increased together. Europe's population, for instance, almost doubled between 1750 and 1850 in just 100 years' time. And even China's population multiplied 4 times between 1650 and 1850. And that was because of the industrialization that was happening and also because of new foods. And just aside from that, there were some waves of change in addition to that. For one, the death rates fell. There was better food, there was better understanding of sanitation and the importance of sanitation. So altogether, the death rates fell. Also, parents began to realize that improved health conditions meant children were more likely to survive. So they didn't have to have 5 kids to be sure that 2 or 3 would make it to adulthood. So the birth rates went down as parents practiced family planning. And this is one instance where the iron law of wages was proved wrong. The iron law of wages said that as income went up, parents would have more kids. And in that instance, it was wrong. So the winners and losers of industrial society. The winners were the new entrepreneurs or the business owners, the factory owners. And this was voiced by a guy named Samuel Smiles in his book, Self-Help. And self-help advocated self-reliance as the key to wealth and prosperity. And in Great Britain, the wealth of the landed nobility began to diminish as the new industrial class grew. And this is depicted actually in the show Downton Abbey, as a wealthy landed family has to deal with their diminishing wealth and the rise of the new industrial class. So who were the losers here? The winners were the new business owners, merchants, upper middle class, and the losers were the laborers. Those were the people working in these inner city factories. Frederick Engels compiled accounts, devastating accounts, of what the working class faced in England. It was called The Condition of the Working Class in England, and it was written in 1845. But Frederick Engels is an important name. You'll see his name a lot of times with that of Karl Marx. But the government reports echoed these conditions. It wasn't just him. Children were sometimes forced to work 12 to 14 hours a day. Mine children worked underground for 14 hours a day with no exposure to sunlight. Despite the hunger, the food they were given was so terrible that they often left it for pigs. So that just tells you how bad the food was, that they were very hungry, malnourished, but the food was so terrible that they would just throw it out. And so this was really just finally got so bad that it led to some remedial legislation, some efforts to improve things. And the first one was the Factory Act. And the Factory Act was passed in 1833. It's called the Factory Act of 1833. But this prohibited the employment of children under 9 years old in the textile mills. And then you have the Poor Law of 1834, so just a year later. The Poor Law gave assistance, a little bit of assistance, just adequate enough to sustain life. The recipients of this assistance lived in government workhouses and worked on government projects. The 10-Hour Act of 1847, That one's going to be self-explained, but it limited the workday to 10 hours. And then the Public Health Act. The Public Health Act of 1848. This was just broad reforms, and that included improving the conditions in the sewers, cleaning up the drains, working on sanitation, making sure that clean water was flowing through the city, and things like that. Redefining gender roles. And this is one thing, the Industrial Revolution really drove a wedge in the home and the workplace. Women who were used to working alongside their husbands experienced changing roles for the first time. And many of these semi-rural factories employed mostly young women. And so they were usually farmers' daughters, young single girls. And some of the early factory owners even built boarding houses for women. And there was one in Massachusetts built by Frances Cabot Lowell. And it promised, hard work. If you put forward hard work, then we'll board you and you'll have enough money to save for marriage. And so by about 1840, about half of the mills in New England followed this model. So they were employing young women. As machinery became heavier, though, and factory work became more prevalent, more men were hired. And one of the reasons for that was simply because machinery was heavy. It was difficult to operate. But as a result, men demanded higher pay because they were the ones supporting their families. And so women were displaced and brought back into the home. By the 1850s, domesticity became the norm, meaning the idea that women should stay home, they should raise their families, take care of their children. For the middle class, that was the norm. Life expectancy increased, living standards improved. In urban areas, though, children were seen as more of a burden than on farms, where, of course, they were useful. So family planning increased, childbearing decreased, and there were some women who began to take white-collar jobs. They became teachers and nurses and sales clerks, and some women worked as domestic servants or prostitutes. Economic and political reform. So the British government was really fearful of reform, and that was best evidenced by what was called the Peterloo Massacre at St. Peter's Fields, play on the Battle of Waterloo, but it was at St. Peter's Fields, so it was called the Peterloo Massacre. This took place in Manchester in 1819 and definitely demonstrated that the government was fearful of reform. And so this started out as a huge but peaceful demonstration of about 80,000 people calling for different things. One was universal male suffrage, letting all men vote without property qualifications or things like that. Another one was election of the House of Commons. Another one was abolition of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws restricted the import of cheaper corn. So people were forced to buy expensive British corn because the Corn Laws prohibited them from buying cheaper imported corn. And so there were people who were going hungry and they weren't able to afford British corn, so they protested the Corn Laws too. So soldiers came in, fired upon the crowd. They killed 11 people, wounded 400 others, and to make matters worse, the government applauded the soldiers and passed further measures to restrict free expression. In the 1830s, though, Parliament's attitude began to change, and this was reflected in some of the bills that were passed and repealed. The first one, the Reform Bill. The Reform Bill was passed in 1832, and it expanded parliamentary seats for the urban constituencies. And it also increased the number of voters by about 60%. So they were becoming much more democratic by doing that. Also, the Municipal Corporations Act. Municipal Corporations Act. And this one was passed in 1835, and it reformed elections and administrations of cities. Anytime you see the word municipal or municipality, think city, on the city level. But it allowed the administrations of cities to cope more successfully with industrial change. And then on top of that, in 1846, Parliament repealed the Corn Laws so that poor people living in Great Britain could buy cheap imported corn again. A big issue during this time was women's suffrage, or the right to vote for women. The failure of women to receive suffrage through peaceful means led Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel to form suffragette organizations, and a lot of times these became violent. Emmeline Pankhurst was thrown in jail more than once. But it really wasn't until after women participated in World War I that it softened the mood toward women voting. And many people reasoned, hey, if women can participate in war, then maybe they should be able to vote. So in 1918, in Great Britain, women over the age of 30 were allowed to vote. And then in 1928, they received equal voting rights with men. And of course, in the United States, women gained the right to vote in 1920. So we'll go ahead and conclude our video here, and we'll pick up in the next video with the labor movement and socialism.